Welcome to another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. This episode will hopefully be uploaded to YouTube as well and also Rumble. If you have any questions, you can email us at arilewishow@hotmail.com. Our guest today is a writer and author of such books as The War on Women in Israel, Conversations with My Body, and the Men's Section. And her new book is called When Rabbis Abuse. So it's great to welcome to the program today, Dr. Elana Sztokman. Dr. Sztokman, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Ari. Thanks for having me.
So there's an interesting thread on Facebook that occurred a few weeks ago that I posted regarding the yahrzeit of a questionable Rebbe that lived in the Katmon area. A lot of people were upset at me about bringing that up. And things such as, well, that's gossip, and what I'm doing is worse than what he did. Someone wrote that, which I think is insane. I want to first start with the concept that it seems a lot of people are scared to simply even bring up this issue. What is a way that people can do that in a way that doesn't violate halakha and Torah law?
Okay, so first of all, we need to recognize what Lashon hara is. Lashon hara is a silencing tactic. Lashon hara is a tactic for telling people you shouldn't talk. And that is a tactic that has been used to silence victims for generations. And so while there's obviously value in Lashon hara in general, when it's used in this particular context, it is not applicable as a halachic concept, and that's not me. I'm not a rabbi, but there are enough halachic authorities out there saying exactly this. That like Rabbi Blau from YU, for example, who has written about this, who says that we cannot be using this concept of lashon hara in cases of abuse, because in fact, speaking about it is vital to the well-being of people, not only of victims, of the entire community. And it's our obligation to talk about it. We have to talk about it, because not talking about it causes great harm. Not talking about it protects the abusers. It protects the people who are doing terrible things, who are causing great harm and damage to innocent victims. So we have to recognize that tactic first and foremost. And then, of course, what we need to do is, sunlight is the greatest disinfectant, as they say. We have to bring these stories to light. We have to talk about it, which is something that the community is not used to doing. We're used to poo-pooing it. We're used to dismissing it. We're used to excusing the actions of, someone who's a quote-unquote leader in the community, because we say, they have such value. Okay, all abusers have redeeming values. All abusers have redeeming qualities. But that's not reason enough to allow them to continue to do such terrible things, to do such harm.
And this particular situation, this Rebbe passed away about 8 years ago. Some people said to me, come on, it's 8 years ago, move on. One of the things I pointed out is, first of all, he still has victims that have to see therapists.
Right.
And there's a Facebook group that has over 500 followers that still look at him as a saint. They don't want to know the truth, or they know about it, but they don't want to admit it, or they don't know about it. I don't know exactly what's going on in that group or why that exists, but they do make him like a saintly figure. And one of the things that I point out is, again, the victims still have to deal with it. The victims might not care that he passed. It might be some relief that he passed away. Okay, but the victims still have to go to therapy. So talk about that issue, that it still continues.
So this idea, move on, where, people say, victims should just move on. Like, victims can't just move on. The damage that sexual abuse does to people is often lifelong. It's a lifelong struggle. You're talking about, damaging or destroying something very precious to people's intimate lives, especially when the abuser is also in a position of authority, like rabbinic authority, a person's a rabbi or a beloved teacher. Then the abuse is not only a matter of physical damage, it's also emotional damage, and it's often spiritual damage. When the abuser is the gatekeeper to a person's religious and spiritual life, then a person's entire pathway towards religion and spirituality is forever broken. Trust is broken. Belief is broken. Relationships are broken. They're all fraught. Triggers come in like a zillion forms. So this isn't something that, you can't just say to a victim, okay, it's over, move on. That doesn't happen. The victims are dealing with it for life, So at the very least, we should at least pause and take a moment and say that the perpetrator should not be allowed to just move on and, get their accolades and whatever. No, if you destroy someone's, an aspect of someone's life, then then you should, then the person who does that should also have their, should not just be allowed to continue and have their reputation unsullied and be called a leader and a charismatic whatever. Like that's just not just. It's not kind. It's not compassionate, and it's not our values as a community. It's not Torah values. Torah values are about v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. It's about compassion. It's about taking care of the people who are weak. It's taking care of the atom and the almanah. It's our religion is supposed to be one of compassion. So we should be compassionate to victims. We should be hearing the stories of victims. We should be caring about victims.
So for the first time, I'm going to actually bring up some of the things that this Rebbe did. I'm not going to say his name on the show, but I think it's important because I have a good hunch that some of his victims are watching this episode, and they should understand they're not alone. Because what I'm about to explain, there might be some people think, oh, I was fooled, I feel so bad about myself, but they should know that it wasn't just them. So basically what this Rebbe did was following. He would get invitations, basically Birthright would send people to his home for Shabbat meals, other organizations. He would get very often young girls, early 20s, new to Judaism, and he would tell them that in a previous life, they were his wife.
Oh.
Yes, not make that up, but they wronged him somehow. So
oh my God.
To tikkun, they have to now make that up to him. And one of the things he did was, he took a young girl, she was about 20 at the time, and he flew her from the United States, and she lived with him for 9 months. And at the time, he was married, 4 young kids. And there were other things I kind of even don't want to say, but very suspicious activity. So one of the things I want to point out is that what I just said, as weird as that sounds, that would not convict the person in court. It's strange. So let's say someone seems strange behavior, but it's not enough to just go to the police or file criminal charges. What would be the best remedy to deal with that?
So first of all, I want to make a different comment about that story. The story that you told is very, very important because it's a classic illustration of a person in authority manipulating a person who has no authority, the person who has all the knowledge, all the authority, all the power, manipulating, emotionally and spiritually manipulating somebody who is powerless in that situation, someone who's newly religious, okay? So the people who are newly religious already feel like, oh, they don't have the creds, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the, day school education, the yeshiva education, so they already feel like, oh, I don't know enough. Orthodoxy does this a lot to people, has lots of ways to make people feel like they're not in, they're not correct, they're not, So there's a lot of layers of power and absence of power in this relationship. So that's number one. So it's important to realize how the abuser manipulates that and is able to say, I know everything. I know everything not only about Judaism, but I know everything about you. I know everything about your soul and your spirit. I mean, it's this like incredible invasiveness, where the rabbi says, I know your soul. And the other person is sort of like, is not in a position, doesn't feel like they know enough to be able to counter that. So that's number one is about the imbalance of power. Number two is the use of religious codes. And so this is something that I uncovered a ton in my research, which is that abusers come from every sector of society, every denomination, every community, everywhere you go, not only in Judaism, but outside of Judaism. But let's talk about the Jewish community for a minute. Within Judaism, every denomination has abusers, has rabbis who abuse. And, it's interesting because everybody always thinks, oh, well, it happens over there. It doesn't happen by us. I talk about that too. But the point is that in every single denomination, there are different religious codes that they use. So, for instance, what I found is that with Orthodox rabbis, they would use things like this. They would use concepts of purity and holiness, kedusha, all kinds of, gilgulim, also like all of that, this idea of the gilgulim and and also sachar, reward and punishment. Like there are a lot of like Orthodox codes, that the Orthodox abuser will use to like get the in, especially codes that they feel that they have ownership of and they have the authority of, and that the victim doesn't. I have knowledge and authority about these codes, and I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell. So that's a lot of like what goes on with Orthodox abuse. So this is a classic case where this is a new one for me. The idea that like, oh, you were my wife in a previous life, like that's very creative.
I'll tell you some off camera too. That was just a taste of what I told you.
Okay.
But go ahead, yeah.
So, but it's classic. In other words, it's classic. And what we should be doing is we need to be training people, students and educators, or community workers, We need to be training them in these kinds of tactics so that when a person, a potential victim, is in a situation like this, they're able to recognize a red flag. That they're able to recognize that something sounds off and that it's okay for you to think that it's off. In other words, that it's okay to challenge authority, and it's okay to say that if you learn something new and it sounds strange to you, it might be strange to you, and you're allowed to say, no, that's too weird for me. Okay, because a lot of times, we're educated, and we educate, in the religious system, in the Jewish system, to sort of trust, to put all the trust and all the authority, and to believe everything. That we're standing on the shoulders of giants and all those kinds of things. We're taught. I'm a graduate of Yeshiva Day School. I'm from Brooklyn, and we learn this all the time. The idea that we don't have the right to question, we don't have the authority to question. If we question something, we were always told well, obviously you don't understand because you haven't studied enough. So you hear that a lot. And I think that contributes to the abuse, because then when a victim is in this kind of situation, or potential victim is in this kind of situation, when the rabbi is there saying all kinds of weird stuff, like, oh yeah, you were my wife in a past life and you have to do tshuva for something, which is so off the wall, you would say, how would somebody believe that? But we're trained to listen and believe and trust whatever they're saying. And I think that needs to change. I think that we need to be more empowered. We need to empower people to listen to themselves more, especially women, especially girls, really need to be empowered to listen to themselves. I heard this from Shana Aronson. I interviewed her for my book. She's the director of Magen. It's an organization that works on advocacy and assistance for victims of sexual abuse. And she had this really interesting insight. She works a lot with the Haredi community. And she said that it's fascinating to her that the same women who, for their entire lives, were hearing about yichud and negia, and in a million years would never sit with a man, sit in the room with a man or let a man touch them. As soon as the rabbi comes and says, oh, it's okay for you to sit alone with me, or it's okay for me to touch you, this is a special situation, then all of those learnings that they had their entire life go out the window, because some rabbi comes and said, oh, it's okay for you to break yichud with me. So what Shana says is that we need to be training women to listen to themselves, and also to trust their own observance, that their observance doesn't have to go through a third party. That if I say I want to keep yichud and I want to keep negia, and even though you are the rabbi with all that authority, you cannot tell me not to keep negia, and you cannot tell me to stop keeping yichud, that we have to train women to listen to themselves that way, and also train people in general to not always place 100% authority in the rabbi, because if a rabbi is telling you something that is wrong to you, or even that goes against your religious practice, or goes against your sense of self in any other way, it's okay for you to say no. It's okay for you to say no, and we don't do that. In the Orthodox community in particular, we don't do that. We don't train people to say no to authority.
And it's interesting to bring up the concept of not questioning, because I would be at these meals and this in front of me, the Rebbe would say things that really cross the line, things with women. Again, I'm really uncomfortable saying it on the camera, but what I thought was, when I first thought that, I'm like, well, Birthright sent people to his house. He must be okay.
Right.
That's the first thing that popped in my head.
Right.
Instead of actually going, wow, I'm like, there's something wrong. But the other part's like, well, Birthright must have checked him out. Not necessarily. And I'll tell you what happened.
That's so fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating, because that's how power works. Power supports power, and we give each other legitimacy. Birthright gives the rabbi legitimacy, and the rabbi gives Birthright legitimacy, and all these locations of power support each other. And that's how abuse gets continues happening, because of how power supports power, and because how it works in all of our minds, just like exactly what you described. That's exactly how it works in our minds. Oh, they must have authority. Oh, they must be legitimate. Oh, sure, this sounds really weird to me, really off. There's something wrong, but can I listen to myself? Can I trust myself? And you find yourself saying no. Oh, well, leaders, names, reputations, organizations, money, power, It's exactly how it works. That is exactly how it works.
And what's interesting was, I also have not told this in public, but I'm going to do this now. What occurred was there were enough complaints for for some reason, I'm not sure exactly why, some women came to me, maybe because of my size or I'm trained in martial arts, whatever it is. They wanted me to go have a talk with him, which I did. And what occurred was, I had a chat with him. So about 6 weeks after that, basically he got very paranoid after my chat. He was he didn't know what was going to happen exactly. And 6 weeks after that, he got very sick. And then 10 months after that, he died. And I think there's a certain feeling that I somehow caused that, but I'm not God. I can't actually do that. And some people thought, well, maybe you shouldn't have had a chat with him. He has young kids, etc. I'm like, I am sorry that his wife is a young widow. I'm sorry their kids don't have a father. But I am a bit relieved that he's not going to do more damage to women. So I understand it's a complicated issue. Sometimes the stuff isn't so simple because he had roles that he kind of needed to do that he's not doing. But you can't just ignore these things forever.
I also would like to point out there's something really dysfunctional about blaming you for his death.
Thank you.
Okay? I mean, that's a very deep dysfunction. That's like, a rabbi who says, oh yeah, the Holocaust happened because, women weren't keeping tzniut and things like that. Like unfortunately, we have a culture like that of, assigning cause and blame in ways that some religious authority wants to. They have an agenda, so they assign blame. You hear it here also, like when there's a terror attack. We had that one of the chief rabbis once said where there was a series of terror attacks. Series of terror attacks because women weren't keeping knias, because women are wearing wigs, and therefore we have to burn their wigs and burn their wigs and Gehenna and all that language. I mean, it's a very problematic way of thinking, that a rabbi, and also it's that concept of the rabbi or the rabbinic authority as the all-knower, like, oh, I know why the terrorism, I know why people suffer, I know. So, that idea that someone can know things that are unknowable, like why a person died, because, but besides that, what that particular dysfunction, when it conflates with this idea of, you have to keep quiet and you have to protect the abuser. So then it's like, dysfunctional by multiples. It's layers upon layers of dysfunction is what it is. And
I did try, for sake of the argument, to go more of a peaceful situation. One of the main things he was doing, at least in action, that I saw was he was giving wine and alcohol to women that were alcoholics, and women were alcoholics.
Oh my God.
And I was saying that just can't happen anymore. And he tried to play like he didn't understand that it was a problem. So I did try to explain. I was trying to give him the benefit of the doubt that it was an issue of incompetence, not malice. But when I saw it was more of an issue of, I guess both, then, I had to kind of do what I had to do. I don't really regret that.
Well, about the issue of giving alcohol to alcoholics, I mean, think about that. So an alcoholic has a very particular vulnerability. It's an obvious and it's a clear and it's a dangerous vulnerability. And so giving the alcohol to the alcoholics is purposefully weakening the victim and making the victim vulnerable. And, there's a zillion implications of that. It's also, I think, sort of like a metaphor of how the abuser manipulates and creates vulnerability by giving the alcohol to the alcoholics. The abuser is masterful at finding the victim's vulnerability and what their particular issue is, whether it's someone who's recently been through a divorce or has recently had a death in their family, or is comes from a poor family, or is a convert or a Baal Tshuva, whatever it is. The place where the person feels insecure, that's exactly what they'll target, and they'll make the person even more insecure. Exactly like that, giving the alcohol to the alcoholic, like.
Yeah, he would say, I have a very expensive bottle of wine. If I open it, will you drink it? Ugh. So it wasn't like she asked and he said, okay, what can I do about it?
That's cruel. I mean, that's cruel on so many levels.
Yes, very problematic. So again, the only last couple of years have I even somewhat spoke about this, even as minimal as Facebook. I didn't think that was even going too far, but some people were upset that even at that. So I decided to double down and we're doing this episode. So I hope people can appreciate that. This is another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here at Israel Sports and News Radio. You can email us at arilewishow@hotmail.com. And our guest today is Dr. Elana Sztokman, and the book is When Rabbis Abuse. Let's talk about a rabbi. You can kind of feel it in the air. Let's address this issue. Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach. I'm going to bring my point of view on it. A lot of people think I'm from New York because I talk with my hands or whatever. I'm from Arizona, country bumpkin. So I have a little bit less bias, if you will. I didn't grow up with Shlomo Carlebach really in any way. My thought process is there's different. It's a little bit complicated. We're not sure exactly what he did, but there's an extreme point of view. He did absolutely nothing wrong, which That's one point of view. There's another point of view that what he did was so bad that it was with kids. That's another extreme. And I'm more personally the middle ground, was that he was probably a womanizer. And part of the reason I say that is because the evidence, the circumstantial evidence, he got married at 49 years old, but he was born in 1925. He grew up in a generation where people got married early 20s, even if they're religious or not. Why he pushed off so far? It looks like rock star, popular, that kind of thing. The question then is, what do we do with the music? If it's a situation where the relationships were consensual, it's one thing. If they were not consensual, which a lot of the allegations are, we have to have a serious conversation of what we do with his music.
Right. So first of all, I don't know what womanizer means. I think womanizer is a term that has to be revisited, because womanizer asserts a certain charm. If a person's a womanizer, you say, oh, well, that's charming. He's just charming and people can't resist his charms. But that's a very one-sided kind of characterization. And so I would like to even revisit that whole concept. So that's first of all. Second of all, I mean, of the evidence, we have the Lilith article that originally exposed him, interviewed girls, girls, not just women. So, and there are a lot of stories about him. So I don't know what the whole getting married at 49, what that means. Is it worse when an abuser is married versus when he's not married? Does it matter? The only difference between an abuser who's married and who's not married is that if he's married, he's also hurting his wife and his family. But other than that, it's the same. The tactics are the same. So in that sense, I am not particularly forgiving to Karabakh at all. I mean, even though I give a lot of respect to his daughter, because I think that she has
She's come forward about it.
And I think that she offers a really interesting model for the people who love the abusers. Like, what are you going to do? He's her father. And so she, I think, is doing a very genuine, authentic reckoning with that, with the idea that on the one hand she recognizes that he did terrible things, but at the same time he was her father. So the question about what we do with music, what do we do with the creations of abusers? So I personally have an extreme view of that. I probably, in the sense that I think that we should not be acknowledging artistry. It's the Wagner question,
right?
The Israel Orchestra had the same question, like, oh, should we play Wagner because of what he did, in the Holocaust? He was an anti-Semite, and he was used by
Hitler's musician.
So I don't think that we should be, I don't think we should be glorifying Wagner's music. I think that there's enough other music out there. So, that's sort of how I feel, because it's just too easy of a way to excuse abusers. To say, oh, but look, they wrote this book. I mean, we have that going, on a smaller scale. The same thing goes on today with Ari Shavit, right? So this is like fascinating. I mean, Ari Shavit is this author who was a Haaretz writer, who has gotten really lucrative book deals and really lucrative speaking tours in America, talking about Israel and Zionism, even though his books are, in my opinion and many people's opinions, not worthy of that. He's extremely sexist in his writing, and he objectifies women in his writing. And it was discovered, that he was also an abuser. So women came forward and talked about his abuse and harassment, and he admitted to it. He totally admitted to it, and he got fired from Haaretz, and for a brief period he was, blacklisted. And then after, a year or two or whatever, he started to get re-invited to all kinds of places, the 92nd Street Y, and he got a new book deal. After all this, he got a new book deal. And I'm like, why? Why would a publisher choose to invest their resources and their time and their energy to promote a book by a guy who not only is he an abuser, but his work is impacted by it. His work is impacted by it. His work shows his ideas about women. So why would we glorify that? So I am very much of the opinion that we should not be glorifying the work of people who we know are abusers. Not only because I think it gives too much power already to people who don't deserve power and should not have power, but also because in many cases, the art itself, what's produced itself, is impacted by views. We have this now also with Stephen Cohen, Professor Stephen Cohen, who was the head sociologist, one of the leading sociologists in the Jewish world for decades, who, his work is very sexist. And people were saying all along that his work was sexist, that in his work he treated women as baby makers and baby machines, and his entire perspective on Jewish sociology is rooted in the idea that women are baby makers and that the goal of Jewish education is to create more Jewish babies. So he was having those opinions at the same time that he was sexually harassing women sociologists, the ones who were coming to him to help build a career in Jewish sociology and to bring other perspectives. The very women who could have come and brought diverse perspectives on what it means to be Jewish and what the goals of the Jewish community should be and what Jewish policy should be. Those same women coming in were the very ones whose careers he stymied because he was hitting on them instead of offering them jobs. So this whole thing like feeds into so many aspects of how this is wrong. So that's why, today I think that we should not be using Stephen Cohen's work for anything. I think we should absolutely be blacklisting Stephen Cohen's work. Not only because of how terribly he treated women, and because the women who he was treating terribly were creative scholars whose careers were ruined, or at least partially ruined in some cases, or in some cases fully ruined because of his actions. Not only that, but also because we have to understand that whatever work he was doing was influenced by his narcissism, by his sexist, megalomaniacal narcissism. So I'm very much of the opinion that we don't need the work of the abusers. And I know it's very painful for Carlebach devotees, because he has a big repertoire of songs that have become
people could see it and not even know it's Carlebach. It's that common in synagogues.
Exactly. So I think it's time for new artistry. We need new artists. We need new liturgists. It's a hard field, liturgy. I hear this from a friend of mine who's in Jewish liturgy, who says that there are very few people going into Jewish liturgy these days. We need new art. We need new creators. We need women creators. And there are. We could replace Carlebach with Debbie Friedman. Any song you sing by Shlomo Carlebach, replace it with a Debbie Friedman song. That's my suggestion. So
it's interesting, to be transparent. Both Svi, my producer, and myself, we were at a Carlebach meeting last Yom Kippur. I hope you'll forgive us for that. But I have a different complicated view with particularly on Yom Kippur. Ironically, I actually want to go to a Carlebach meeting because the way I look at it is, I don't know if this will sound right, but Yom Kippur is like a day for sinners. And he did these bad things, and the idea that he still would have a redeeming value, I have to have that type of approach with all humanity. Even the Rebbe that I just mentioned has come back, as he did and the things he did, that there's some type of goodness, some way that can somehow be built on. You can extract good from bad people. It's kind of...
No, I understand that. I appreciate that sentiment. I absolutely appreciate that sentiment. The problem is that you're forgiving Carlebach
for what he did to other people.
So you need to get permission from those other people. If those other people forgive him, if all his victims come forward and say, yes, we forgive, then I'm okay to forgive. But he didn't hurt me personally. So it's very easy for me to say, oh, well, I forgive him. He didn't hurt me. And that's a little bit problematic, and it also puts a lot of pressure on the victims to get to a place of forgiveness, whether or not they may be ready. And that pressure is also really, really problematic. There's somebody named Raquel Silverman, who wrote a piece in Jewish Women's Archive that I quoted in my book also, which talks a lot about this. It talks about the experience of victims being pressured to forgive so that the perpetrator could do tshuva and get their reputation back. And it's very problematic because it's re-traumatizing. It places the victim back into a situation of, doubling the trauma, so that it's not just that I was, abused. It was also that I was abused and the whole world is telling me to get over it. To telling you that it's no big deal. You get past it. We want to get past it. We want to bring the abuser back because we like the abuser. We value the abuser more than we value you. I mean, that's the message to victims. The message to victims, when you say to victims like, oh, we're ready to move on, we're ready to forgive, we're ready to come back and bring their music again or whatever it is, you're basically saying, well, the abuser counts more than the victim counts. And that's a message that gets throughout our communities. When an abuser is allowed to stay in their pulpit, for example, which happens all the time, while victims drop out. We don't even have records of how many victims drop out of Jewish life. It's not the type of records that are being kept because, people like Stephen Cohen did not do that kind of research. So federations everywhere are not doing that kind of research to find out who are the victims who are dropping off because they were experiencing abuse. We have no community data on that at all. But, so what we have is a situation where there are a lot of congregations where the abuser is still in a position of power and, still has their pulpit, and, victims drop out. I mean, there was this case of in the conservative movement of Ferber. Is that his name? Stephen? I might be getting his name wrong. Ferber. I'm forgetting for a second. I want to say Ferber, but I feel like I'm saying it wrong. Anyway, it was a recent case where the conservative movement, the conservative movement says that the conservative movement doesn't have the authority to remove rabbis from their pulpit. It's not like a centralized authority. But there's this conservative, but they have an ethics committee, and the ethics committee found that this rabbi had in fact, sexually abused congregant, relentlessly pursued this married congregant. He was married, the congregant was married, he kept pursuing this congregant to go into a quote-unquote open relationship with him. She had approached him to work on stuff for the shul, and he in turn said, come have sex with me, and he did that relentlessly, and she eventually complained. And the community basically said, okay, that happened, but we really like the rabbi, so he can stay. So, what does it say to the victim? It says to the victim that you don't matter as much as he does. I had a chat with someone from the community who's close to the victim, and it's like that really is the message. The message to the victim is, you're just not as important as he is. So, that's problematic.
So let's go to this question then. So Svi and I were at this, as I mentioned, this Karbach synagogue last Yom Kippur, and they all, it's not like that we're Karbach people, but we were invited to help make the minyan, and we had a good time. So the question is then, how come the people in the Karbach world are not acknowledging what Shlomo, some of the things, the allegations against them? Do they really not see it? Do they not care? What would be your take about it?
They don't care.
Just as that simple.
They probably believe it, but they don't care enough. It is that simple. I mean, so there are two aspects to it. Okay, there are certain people who say we don't believe.
Okay.
So there's definitely a we don't believe group, but I think that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem, I think, is not only the ones who say we don't believe. It's the people who say, yeah, we believe, but we don't care. It's not important enough. It's not interesting enough. His music is more important, or whatever it is that he did. His legacy is more important. That I think is much more common and much more problematic. But again, it's a multitude of tactics. There are a multitude of tactics for supporting abusers and throwing victims under the bus, and these are different ones. So the not believing the victim is one, creating a whole other story about the victim is another. Where victims are called unstable or insane or not really one of us. There are a lot of ways to discount a victim by delegitimizing them, delegitimizing who they are. I mean, so there's the disbelieving, there's the delegitimizing, and then there's the not caring. And from what I see, and this isn't like statistical or anything, it's just my observations. The not caring is the most common, where it's that, yeah, okay, it probably happened, but like, so what? So what? It's just not that important because we have so many more important things to do. For instance, like here in Israel also, we had that situation in 2014 during, there was, the war in Gaza in 2014. So there was a campaign going on there about sexual abuse. And some Knesset members were trying to pass a bill having to do with sexual harassment. And Moshe Feiglin at the time said, what are you doing this for? What are you dealing, we're in the middle of a war. What are you dealing with rainbows and fairies? That's what he said. What are you dealing with rainbows and fairies? As if to say, like, sexual abuse is like, it's a luxury item. It's not something that we deal with when we're dealing with the important things in life, the serious things in life, war, terror, existential threats from Iran or whatever it is. There's always like something more important. That's the message. The message is that there's always something more important than, the victims of sexual abuse. Because victims of sexual abuse are often not the people with power or, and even if they are, as soon as a victim comes forward, they often lose their position of power. They're often sidelined in other ways, as opposed to, perpetrators who often are kept in positions of power. So, that's what I observe. But it's a multitude of things. There's lots of different ways to dismiss victims, lots of different tactics. And we need awareness. We need awareness in our community of what these tactics look like, of what people are doing when they say, oh, that can't be true. Oh, there's something off about that story, or maybe she really wanted it, or, maybe there seems something off about that victim. That victim, she seems, that person who's telling a story, she seems so, unstable. She seems so this, that, and the other. we have to recognize those tactics for what they are. They're silencing tactics, they're delegitimizing tactics, and they're tactics that come from people's desires to stay connected to someone in power. I mean, ultimately, what it's about, why do people, hang on to the people in power? Is because people like power. People like being attached to someone in power. They like to be attached to someone who seems to have status, seems to have authority. If I'm close to someone who has power and authority, I don't want to let that go. I'd rather, dismiss the people who are saying bad things about them. It's easier. It's more convenient. So we have to recognize these tactics. We have to recognize these dynamics in ourselves and in the people around us and in our communities, the tendencies within ourselves to dismiss others and, to delegitimize others. We have to recognize these tactics. So that's the work.
And for those who think that Shlomo Carlebach didn't do anything wrong, some things I'll point out is that in 1959, approximately, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was asked a question about a rabbi who created music, but there were questions about his character. They don't say Shlomo Carlebach's name directly, but it's pretty obvious. You can figure it out. And Rabbi Moshe gave basically a 10-page answer explaining about what we could do with the music. He basically held that the music made before this composer did something wrong would be acceptable, and music afterwards would not be acceptable. I want to go a little more specifically about the evidence against it, because we talked about the allegations and some of the articles written about it. Do we, the allegations enough, or I guess are enough to convince people would look at it? Is that what you would say that?
Oh, the allegations are pretty strong.
They're detailed.
Yeah, details, names, places, dates, times, details of conversations. Right. Today there would be records. Today there would be, phone records and text messages and things like that.
Because Rabbi Carlebach passed away in 1994, so all these things were before 1994, so it was less technology advances. But meaning the amount of allegations are how many at this point, recorded?
I don't know.
Okay, but
I don't have that data.
But we do know that there's also. It's not such maybe a fair thing to say, but there's certain allegations that weren't brought up and not recorded. We could probably fair to say,
Always. There's always more. There are very few abusers who do it just once or get caught the first time. I mean, that's very, very rare. Most of the time, an abuser does it over time and gets more elaborate over time. It gets better at their tactics over time. And we know that the percentage of people reporting abuse is minuscule. I mean, we're talking single digits in some cases. So, and my research confirms that. Very few of the people who I spoke to reported to any kind of authority. There are some people who, there's some research, not mine, but there's research on sexual abuse in the Haredi community that found that the reporting was so low that for some people, the first time they ever disclosed the abuse was to the researcher. That they had never talked about it until they were asked about it by a researcher. So, reporting and disclosure is very, very low. And so for every story that we hear, chances are there are 3 or 4 at least that we haven't heard. That's across the board. That's not even just the Jewish community. That's across the board with sexual abuse in general that people don't disclose and don't report for, a zillion reasons. Guilt, shame, fear, feeling not, and it takes time to acknowledge it. It takes time to figure out what happened. It takes time to it takes time to figure out what just happened to you, and then it takes time to process it within yourself. And then the first time, you tell somebody about it, it's often hesitant. I mean, not always, but in many, many cases, there's a hesitance to talking about it. It's extremely private. It's extremely intimate. It's in many cases very shaming. The victims feel so ashamed about it so often. There's also a lot of times feelings of guilt, why couldn't I have stopped this? What did I do to bring it on? Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I invited it, things like that. So there's lots and lots of barriers to disclosure and to reporting. So for as many stories as we heard about Carlebach, I'm sure there are many more. It's just that's the way this is. That's the way this goes.
So last question about Carlebach, at least for this episode. Should people be at a point where they go to synagogues that they attend and say, maybe we got to pull some of Shlomo's music?
Yeah.
You would say, okay.
Yeah, I think that would be a huge action towards protecting victims, yes. To making, not just protecting victims, but for creating safe spaces, creating safe communities. Because, if you're singing Carlebach's music, it comes up in davening, and then, one of his victims walks in,
Right.
That person is going to be
Could be traumatized.
Yes. So, and not come back, and then therefore not do davening and not participate in, in the holidays or all kinds of things. So, yeah, I think so.
All right, this is another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports News Radio. You can email us at arilewishow@hotmail.com. And our guest today is Dr. Elana Sztokman, and the book is When Rabbis Abuse. So let's talk about something. I don't know if you get this question a lot, but let's talk about when men are abused.
Yeah.
I'll tell you also a couple of personal stories. There was a rabbi I thought that said stuff to me that was a little bit cross the line. Called me cute, sweetheart, touched me on the side, asked if I was ticklish. Then he went to grab my chin and I punched him.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, it was in the arm. But still, he didn't bother me after that.
Oh.
It was unfortunate it had happened. Sometimes when things happen. But there was also an interesting situation myself about 5 years ago during the Me Too movement, where I posted some stories involving me where I thought that I was harassed and things went too far. And guess what happened? A lot of people, they made fun of me. Oh, you must have really wanted it. Or who are you? You're a guy. Of course, guys like it. No, that's not necessarily true. Guys don't necessarily like to be harassed or abused,
right,
or have women even say things that are inappropriate. And sometimes guys are looked at strange if they don't like that. And I think that's insane. So I want to get your thoughts about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of research backing what you're saying, that male victims often have extra layers of shame and guilt and blame and mocking. Those are real phenomena, and that they also are extra barriers to reporting from men. Also, I'm not gay, so you don't think I'm gay and all of that. Or, you're not strong enough. Are you not strong enough? One of my interviewees, a strong adult male who was also very aware of these issues and was, very super aware of what sexual abuse is and very physically able to
defend himself. Yeah.
Was still nevertheless attacked by a rabbi, a colleague. He kept saying no to the guy, and he said he said no, and the guy said, okay, I'll take no for an answer. Could I just have a hug, goodbye? And before he knew it, he was being attacked.
Right.
And so that was a really important story in the research, because it breaks a lot of those misconceptions, that people can get attacked even if they're smart, aware, savvy, vocal, eloquent, physically strong, well-trained. At the end of the day, all of these can be overcome by a determined abuser, because that's what abusers do. They know how to get around these things. That is what they are. That's what they train themselves in. That's what it means to be an abuser and a manipulator. They know how to get around all of that.
Well, I just want to the Me Too movement, though, I think part of the reason people made fun of me because I was talking about women that were harassing me.
Even worse, exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because people have this idea that can't happen. Right. It's not true. It can't happen.
Not true. And also, the issue of women as abusers. So that's something that I talk a lot about also, because there is a very strong misconception that women can't be abusers, and it's wrong. Women can be abusers. I mean, first of all, you don't need a particular body part to abuse. You can use lots of different body parts. You can use objects, physically. And also not all abuse is physical. A lot of sexual abuse starts, emotionally. And so there are a lot of tactics that women have at their disposal. And, an abuser is a personality. It's a particular personality type. It's someone, not all men are abusers. Obviously, just because you're a man, you're not going to be an abuser, because it's not something that you do just because you're a man. Abuse is something that happens because you have a narcissistic personality disorder or some other disorder. And so women can have those disorders just as easily. And there are lots of ways to manipulate a person. There are lots of ways to emotionally and spiritually and physically and sexually manipulate another person.
Psychological abuse also.
Yeah, exactly. So, and all of these tactics are available to people of all genders. People of all genders can be abusers. People of all genders can be victims. Absolutely. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't certain, odds. So, but the odds might be wrong. So this is interesting, so there are a lot of statistics that show that something like 90% of all abusers are men. But the research that describes what you're talking about, which is about men as victims, so some of the research about men as victims suggests that the underreporting among male victims is so strong that those numbers might be totally skewed, that it might be totally wrong, that we may actually have almost no idea how frequent the female abuser on a male victim is, or female abuser on a female victim. Female abusers on female victims is also something that carries a lot of stigmas. So I interviewed some female victims of a female abuser, and they in a religious community, and this woman said to me that the reaction wasn't just that, like, we don't believe you. So they experienced all that stuff of, we don't believe you and you're making it up and all stuff. But they also experienced who cares? Lesbianism isn't against the Torah. Like that. Like, so what, girls playing around. Like, that's how it was cast. And it's like, no, it wasn't that. It was abuse.
With like the life for situation.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, if you're under a rock, there was a woman that I guess we call her Rabbinit. What would we call her title? But apparently there were some allegations. It was very complicated for some reason to extradite her from Israel to Australia.
It wasn't complicated.
They just didn't want to do it. Corrupt. Okay.
It was Litzman's corruption. Okay. So they had like 50 extradition hearings here in Israel to get Malka Leifer extradited. She extradited back to Australia where she conducted the alleged abuse. The role of the state of Israel here is really, really shameful, really embarrassing. That the state of Israel just didn't extradite her, and she was mostly protected by Yaakov Litzman, the Knesset member from one of the Haredi parties, who protected her and did everything he could. And there was a big expose on Israeli television. I don't know if you saw that one. Showing what how much he protected her and the lengths that he would go. So Litzman is now about to go on trial. And now he was recently forced to resign from the Knesset because of all this and facing indictment, or I don't know exactly where it stands. He was either indicted or facing indictment, but he is now being investigated about his corruption and can't serve in the Knesset right now. And now Malka Leifer finally, after years, these victims were coming back and forth between Australia and Israel for like 5 years or 7 years, something like going back and forth all the time for these trials, for these hearings, to try to get her to be extradited. So finally she was extradited this year, about I think maybe like 6 months ago. She was finally sent back to Australia, and the trial is starting, I believe, in August, something like that. It's soon, like the trial is starting soon, and it's such a shanda. What the state of Israel did to protect Leifer instead of looking after victims is absolutely shanda. And we're seeing it again, and it's happening again. Now, well, not exactly the same situation, but now we have the Baruch Lanner story. Okay, so Baruch Lanner is a guy who for 30 years, as one of the head counselors in NCSY and the principal of a school in Deal, New Jersey, he was abusing teenagers all the time. Like, everybody knew. Dozens and dozens of testimonies came to NCSY when the late Pinchas Stolper was the head of it. Finally, Gary Rosenblatt of the Jewish Week did an expose about this. He wrote an article about Baruch Lanner in, I think it was like 2002, I want to say, something like that. And eventually that landed Baruch Lanner in jail. He served 3 years for all of this. Many of his victims live in Israel. The few of his victims live in Efrat. He was abusing women and girls and boys, adults, teenagers, and everybody knew. And so Pinchas Stolper told Gary Rosenblatt, he said, yeah, but he's such a good educator. Everybody loves him. It's classic. It's this classic, what's called the Pied Piper syndrome. The Pied Piper syndrome, that was a term coined by Paul Shaviv. Paul Shaviv is a veteran Jewish educator. He wrote a book about Jewish education. And in this book, he describes the Pied Piper syndrome. The Pied Piper syndrome is the situation that we have in many, many Jewish educational settings, where you have some guy who's like super charismatic, he's full of that personality, and he gets people to follow him, and people love him, and he's so cool, so popular. And what Paul Shaviv says is that Pied Pipers always leave a mess in their wake. They always leave a mess. They leave people, kids messed up in a zillion ways, and prone to abuse. It's emotionally manipulative and often emotionally abusive. And in Baruch Lanner's case, Baruch Lanner was a classic Pied Piper. He was the classic Pied Piper, the super cool, the one that everybody was following. So parents loved him, and teachers loved him, and kids were saying, that he's abusing us. He was soliciting girls all the time. He was hitting on girls all the time, and also very physical and punching and kicking and slapping and tons of stories.
Not in defense.
No, and you should read. I don't know if you read Gary Rosenblatt's expose. It's a really important testimony. That's one of the most important writings that has been done on the issue of sexual abuse in the community was Gary Rosenblatt's story about Baruch Lanner. So was the Lilith story about Karl Bach was also one of the most important writings. Gary Rosenblatt's story about Baruch Lanner came a few years later. These exposés are super important because they give details about how this happens and what abuse looks like. And in both cases, we're talking about a very quote-unquote charismatic type of leader who had a huge following and all of that. Anyway, Baruch Lanner went to prison for a couple of years. And this week, it was announced in the news that Baruch Lanner is, coming to Israel. He applied for citizenship in Israel. And so the Israeli government is now considering, citizenship for Baruch Lanner. And it's like, when is Israel going to learn the lesson here about not giving refuge to abusers? We shouldn't be giving refuge to abusers. I don't understand it. It's the Malka Leifer story, all over again. I mean, Malka Leifer was worse because it was while there was all the pressure to extradite her. And the Israeli government was just resisting, was just not doing what they were supposed to do. Here you can make the argument, well, he did his time, he served his time, whatever. But I don't know, it's really problematic.
So it's interesting, the title of your book, When Rabbis Abuse, is because a friend of mine brought up this idea that why in particular would a rabbi be more likely to abuse, let's say, than a non-rabbi? And the idea, my friend said, was, well, it's this power idea. A person, positive, like it or not, to become a rabbi, they have to have a certain bit of an ego, and then they have to feel like they're doing the right thing, telling people to do certain things. And then, unfortunately, that aspect could be an abuser.
Exactly.
So
I have a whole chapter on that.
Okay.
So I have a whole chapter on the profile of the abuser, and I do an analysis basically comparing the traits of the abuser with the traits of narcissists. And there's a lot of overlap. That's not to say that all rabbis are narcissists, and that's not to say that all rabbis are abusers. But there is a problem in our community in how we define leadership and what we consider to be characteristics of value. So in many cases, what we see as valuable characteristics in a leader are the very same characteristics of narcissists. It's someone who likes to perform, likes to be on stage, likes the adulation of others, likes to move a crowd, maybe a good speaker, a good musician, all of those things. We value a lot of performative types of qualities in our rabbis. We value the good, speech, the one that makes us feel something. We feel uplifted. But if you feel something differently, it could very well be that the person has been emotionally manipulating you. In other words, that ability to move a crowd is the ability to emotionally manipulate others. So it's tricky. It's really tricky, because yes, everybody loves a good sermon, but sometimes what we're really looking for is we're looking for the rabbi who can do something and be some kind of celebrity star. And is that really what we should be valuing? Is that really what makes a person worthy? Is that what makes a person worthy, the ability to perform? So after doing all this research and, hearing all about the charisma, so many victims talked about the rabbi's charisma, the same rabbi who abused them. The charisma is used to reel them in and to get their trust and, trust me, So we have to really, as a community, be revisiting this. We as a community, I believe, need to be revisiting how we value a person's ability to perform versus how they are, how they are on the interpersonal level, really, because there are other values that we might want to see in rabbis, like humility, modesty, care, compassion, actual compassion, not the desire to manipulate the person who is suffering. One of my interviewees talked a lot about this, about how the rabbi, there was the rabbi in her synagogue who had been discovered to be abusing boys for many years. He's still a rabbi in the community because he's so beloved for how he deals with things like funerals and weddings. Like, people love for him to be the Masada Kedushin at the weddings because he gives such a great speech, right? And that when he comes to a house of mourning, he always knows how to say the right thing that makes the people feel whatever, It's a lot about him doing all the talking. And so people feel a certain thing because he's doing all the talking. And she was basically saying that, it's all a front. That it's all a front. It's all this charismatic manipulation, as opposed to just sort of holding space for a person. That a characteristic of somebody who's like actually doing actual caring for a person who, let's say, is in mourning, might not want to speak at all, but might want to just like hold a space for the other person. So another interview, so that was one interviewee, and another interviewee said some very similar things also about the rabbi who abused her, about how, everybody loves him because, he gives such a good speech, and because he flirts, he makes them laugh and all that kind of stuff. And so she said that she's now on the search committee for a new rabbi in her shul. And she says that she has become very suspicious of a candidate who says, oh, I love doing all of those, Shiva calls. I love, to come to the, people where people are like suffering. She says because she doesn't trust it. She no longer trusts that comes from a place of compassion. She has to like decide whether that, the love of the pastoral care is actually a love for pastoral care, or it's a narcissistic desire for emotional control and manipulation. So we as a community need to start having that conversation for real. To start asking ourselves, like, what makes a good rabbi really? Is it the rabbi who like always knows the right thing to say, or is it a rabbi who actually has compassion? Those are two different things. They're two very different things. And often the person who is so in love with themselves that they like, love being up there on the bima, giving that, speech or whatever, that is not at all the same characteristic of the person who one-on-one has compassion and care and knows how to deal with people in a spiritual crisis or an emotional or some other crisis. They're very, very different personalities. So, what do we value? Who do we consider the person of value? Which, of course, goes back to what I was saying before about how we react to abuse is also very often a reflection of who we consider valuable. If we say that the person who can get up on the stage and give a great speech or be a great Masada Kedusha and tell the great jokes under the chuppah, if we think that those are the great characteristics, or do we think the characteristics are the person who, in private knows how to hold space for another person and knows how to care for another person by just being compassionate? Like, what do we value? What do we as a community value? Those are my big questions.
All right, this is another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. The email, of course, arilewishow@hotmail.com. And our guest today is Dr. Elana Sztokman. The book, again, is When Rabbis Abuse. So I want to leave off this question because it's important we discuss this, but I can see how a lot of people watching this would feel a bit depressed. It seems like there's not a lot of hope that people we count on are taking advantage of us and doing bad things and manipulating us. What is your message of hope that things can get better and we can look at things in a positive way?
So, I would also like to leave with a message of hope. The last chapter of my book, I have a whole list of recommendations for little and big things that communities can do to protect victims, to create safe spaces, to make our sacred spaces safe, to create policies that protect abusers, that protect victims instead of abusers, that make it possible for people to report and disclose safely. Policies that are based on, awareness. It's just a little bit of awareness, So that's part one. So part one is creating policies, creating awareness, making formal changes within community rules. But that's only half of what can and should be done. The other half is about culture. That's harder to change. In other words, there's two aspects of change. One is formal policies, and one is understated cultural shifts. And so both need to happen, and they need to support each other. You can't have policy changes without cultural changes, and you can't have cultural changes without policy changes. Otherwise, the change doesn't really happen. So while the policy changes are happening, I would really like to see the cultural changes happening. Of the things that we've been talking about whose life is considered valuable, who is considered valuable, how we are starstruck by rabbis, how we overvalue celebrity, how we overvalue performance, how we overvalue money, for example. We didn't even talk about donors. I have a whole chapter on donors who also are given a pass because, people with money have status just like rabbis have status. There are certain people who have status. So cultural shifts have to do with how we assign status, how we assign importance, how we decide whose value, whose life has value, whose life it has worth? How do we decide who we care about? Also, studies into what's going on in the community in terms of dropout. What is happening with victims who are dropping out of communities? Who are those people who are dropping out? Start to care about victims in communities, in resources, in research, and culturally, to make those cultural shifts, to start paying attention to how we listen to people's stories when they're telling stories about their pain. Are we creating excuses in our brain? Oh, they must be making it up. Oh, they must be unstable. Oh, that can't be true. Oh, Birthright is supporting this rabbi, so it must not be right. What kinds of texts we have going in our brains about authority, about status, all of those things. To start critiquing those things. That's the cultural shift that I would really like to see happen. I think we need both. In other words, I think we need both the policy and the cultural shift. And the hope is that I think it's happening. I think that it's starting to happen. I think social media can help. Social media can also harm. Social media brings out the best and the worst in humanity. It could be places where people are, do the awful pile-ons. But social media is also a place where people realize that they're not alone. So that's powerful. That can be powerful. So, I think that victims are coming forward. Victims are finding each other. And also they're starting to share their stories and to, find people who aren't victims. I hope my book helps. I really hope that this book becomes a force for change, that people are reading it, and that people who are reading it are bringing these ideas to their shuls and their schools and their communities and their families and their workplaces and saying, hey, let's rethink some of this. That's what I really hope. That's my hope. My hope is that this book, along with, other changes going on around us, will start creating the shifts that we need so that we can be a holy nation again, that we can be a sacred nation again.
Light to the nations, too. B'ezras Hashem.
B'ezras Hashem.
B'ezras Hashem.
B'ezras Hashem.
All right, if people want to get the book, where can they go do that?
Amazon.
Amazon, okay.
And I also have a website, www.whenrabbisabuse.com, but the simplest is just look for it on Amazon.
Okay, so go look on Amazon or go to Dr. Sztokman's website. Again, this is another episode of the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. The email is arilewisshow@hotmail.com. And our guest today has been Dr. Elana Sztokman. Thank you for being on the program.
My pleasure.
Very interesting conversation.
Thanks for having me.
And
thanks for all the work that you do also for speaking out and fighting and for also hosting this. Even just the fact of hosting this podcast is a really important step. So thanks for that.
Yeah, well, you know what? As I said before the show started, some people are too cowardly to talk about it, but we're not. So,
yay.
And that's what this podcast is. This podcast is about. Some stages won't air the stuff, but we will. So,
yay.
Thank you everyone for watching, listening, and God bless and good day.